What if one of the biggest fast food empires in history was created by someone who spent most of his life failing? For decades, nothing seemed to work. Jobs ended badly. Businesses collapsed. And opportunity after opportunity slipped through his fingers. By the time most people would have accepted defeat, he was nearly broke and running out of time. But one small idea would eventually spread across the entire world, turning a struggling roadside cook into the face of one of the most recognizable restaurant brands on the planet. And that man was Colonel Harlan Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Long before millions of people were eating fried chicken in restaurants around the world, Harlan Sanders was just a kid growing up in Indiana. Life wasn't easy. When he was only 5 years old, his father passed away. His mother had to work long hours to support the family, which meant young Harlan had to stay home and take care of his younger siblings. At an age when most kids were playing outside, Sanders was in the kitchen, learning how to cook. He didn't know it yet. But those early meals he prepared for his family would eventually shape the future of the fast food industry. But success wouldn't come anytime soon. In fact, Sanders spent the next several decades bouncing between jobs. Before he ever became famous, Sanders worked almost every job you could imagine. He was a farmhand, a streetcar conductor, a railroad worker, an insurance salesman, even a tire salesman. But most of these jobs didn't last long. Sometimes he quit. Sometimes he was fired. And sometimes things ended badly. At one point, he even got into a physical fight with his boss. By the time Sanders reached middle age, he had already experienced more career failures than most people do in a lifetime. But everything began to change during the Great Depression. In the early 1930s, Sanders began operating a small gas station in Corbin, Kentucky along U.S. Route 25. Travelers constantly stopped there to fill up their cars. But Sanders noticed something interesting. Many of those travelers were hungry, and there were very few places nearby where they could eat. So he started cooking meals for customers right inside the gas station. At first it was simple food: ham, biscuits, vegetables. But one thing quickly became the favorite: fried chicken. Word began spreading that a gas station in Corbin served some of the best fried chicken around. Soon, people were stopping, not just for gas, but specifically for Sanders' cooking. Business grew so quickly that Sanders eventually opened a full restaurant across the street. It was called Sanders Court and Cafe, and that's where the magic really started. Sanders became obsessed with perfecting his fried chicken. He experimented with different seasoning combinations until he created a special blend of 11 herbs and spices. But the flavor wasn't the only innovation. Traditional fried chicken took a long time to cook, which made it difficult to serve customers quickly. So Sanders began using a relatively new kitchen tool at the time: a pressure fryer. This allowed the chicken to cook faster while staying juicy on the inside and crispy on the outside. The result was something customers loved. Soon the restaurant became one of the most popular roadside stops in the region. Sanders' reputation continued growing. And in 1935, the governor of Kentucky gave him an honorary title: Kentucky Colonel. From that point forward, Harlan Sanders became known as Colonel Sanders. He embraced the image completely: the white suit, the black string tie, the goatee. It would eventually become one of the most recognizable brand identities in the world. But just when things were going well, everything suddenly changed. In the early 1950s, the American highway system began expanding rapidly. A new interstate highway, Interstate 75, was built. But there was one big problem. The new highway completely bypassed Corbin, which meant travelers were no longer driving past Sanders' restaurant. Almost overnight, his business collapsed. The once busy restaurant became quiet. Customers disappeared. Eventually, Sanders was forced to sell the property. At the age of 65, he had lost nearly everything. It was left with little more than his car and a small Social Security check. For most people, this would have been the end of the story. But Sanders had one idea left. Sanders believed his fried chicken recipe was still special. So instead of opening another restaurant, he came up with a completely different idea. He would franchise the recipe. Sanders began traveling across the country visiting restaurant owners. His pitch was simple: if they used his recipe and cooking method, they would pay him a small fee for every chicken sold. But convincing people wasn't easy. Most restaurant owners said no, again and again. Legend says Sanders was rejected more than 1,000 times. He often slept in his car while traveling from town to town trying to convince someone to give his chicken a chance. Finally, in 1952, one restaurant owner in Salt Lake City agreed to try it. That restaurant became the first official franchise. and it introduced a new name for the chicken. Asterisk asterisk. Kentucky Fried Chicken. Once the idea caught on, the growth was unbelievable. Restaurant owners loved the concept. Customers loved the chicken. And franchises began opening across the United States and Canada. Within a decade, there were more than 600 locations. Sanders became the face of the brand, traveling from restaurant to restaurant, making appearances, and ensuring the quality stayed the same. His white suit and Southern personality made him instantly recognizable. The small recipe that once came from a roadside restaurant had turned into a national phenomenon, and it wasn't slowing down. In 1964, Sanders made a huge decision. He sold the company for $2 million to a group of investors, led by John Y. Brown Jr., but he didn't disappear from the brand. Instead, Sanders became the official ambassador for the company. He traveled the world promoting the restaurant and appearing in advertisements. His image became the official logo, and the company continued expanding internationally. All built from a recipe that almost never had a chance. Sometimes the biggest companies in the world start with brilliant ideas. But sometimes, they start with someone who simply refuses to quit. And in this case, all it took was one man, one recipe, and one last chance.